And welcome back. Now, yesterday's 2019 maiden budget speech for Finance Minister Tito Mboweni has a lot of tongues wagging this morning still. And let's unpack it now with our three analysts. In studio with me, Billy Joubert, who is Deloitte Director of Transfer Pricing and Specialist in Base Erosion and Profit Shifting, or BEPS. And then also with us is economist and analyst at the Competition Economics and Regulation Practice at Genesis Analytics. And in fact, she's a development economist, Nwambisa Nontenjwa. And then in our Cape Town studio this morning is Kenosi Magosha. And she is Head of Client Solutions and Savings at Sanlam Personal Finance. And welcome to all of you. And thanks for coming through to help us unpack this.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
But let me start by taking your reaction to Minister Tito Mboweni's speech. Let me start at the end there with you, Billy.
I think that, I'm a tax specialist, and from a tax point of view, we have very little room to maneuver. We are quite heavily taxed. So there was very little prospect of increasing tax rates. I think what we've got is the tax bracket staying the same, and that has an increased effect due to a phenomenon called fiscal drag. In other words, we're not adjusting the brackets to keep up with inflation. And I think the other key element that we've all been watching with interest is SARS, and to see what's going to happen at SARS. And he outlined 5 very specific steps that will be taken to beef SARS up again, because obviously SARS is the engine that brings in the money. So it's of great importance that we get SARS right. So I think from a tax point of view, those are the main features.
Nwambisa, what stood out for you?
I was also quite pleased with the Minister of Finance's announcement to strengthen SARS. It remains to be seen how quick that will translate to increased revenue collection, of course. And of course, the big moment for the budget speech was Eskom's restructuring and the announcement of Eskom's restructuring. Many see this as a precursor to some form or some level, even a partial level of privatization, and I think much can be said about that.
And Kenosi, for you?
The budget was a good but tough budget which the minister had to deliver, and I think most households and consumers were looking for some relief and some hope in terms of opportunity that the minister will create for employment. And we saw that he actually took initiatives to increase incentives for promoting youth employment, as well as creating incentives for certain sectors such as the clothing and textile sector to create jobs. But he also had a focus on poor and low-income households, in that he increased social grants to state-owned social child grants, so that poor households can be able to navigate this tough economic conditions. And on the revenue side, obviously the minister was going to touch on personal income tax and was not going to touch on rates per se, but was going to work with the brackets by not adjusting them, as Billy has mentioned earlier.
So let's get to grips with these tax implications, Billy. As you said, the brackets not being adjusted, but talking about, personal income tax, and the South African taxpayer is really, really being squeezed dry here. And then many of the opposition parties raising the question about corporate taxes and why we are so reluctant to perhaps increase corporate tax. What's your take on that?
Well, far more of our tax revenue comes from tax on individuals. The second biggest contributor is VAT. So I think, corporate income tax is only the third biggest. So if we're wanting to grow our tax base quickly, what we really need to do is get people in employment, because they're the ones who contribute the most. And what we've currently got is a phenomenon where a relatively small number of people contribute a big chunk of the tax revenue. So I think if we can get people in employment, that'll help us a lot. If we can get people spending money in the economy, they'll be paying VAT, and that's the second biggest contributor. So while corporate tax is important, I think we need to remember it's only the third biggest element and the third biggest contributor. And so both from a social and a tax collection point of view, the best thing we can do in this economy is create jobs. And if we create jobs, people will earn money, and if they earn money, they'll spend it in the economy.
The problem, though, is, Nwabisa, we are not creating jobs. The economy is not growing. Well, some would say it's not growing at all, really, relative to what we are spending in this country. But the opposition party saying that the minister didn't give any concrete details with regard to that specific plan of how to grow this economy. What's your take on that?
Economics 101 tells us that the government, or actually fiscal spending, has a lot to do with increasing GDP or growing the economy. And if we saw the actions of economies like the US and China at the in response to the 2008 financial crisis, many of them engaged in quite large and sweeping fiscal spending. I think the US spent close to 800 billion, and much of that was funded with a fiscal deficit. And so I think that was the element of this particular budget that was disappointing for me. I mean, if you look at our economy, we're really in crisis. We have unemployment levels that are unprecedented, really. And one does long for or desire that our government really takes a more radical or a more proactive step in stimulating the economy.
Such as, because we've been going from one budget speech to the next for many years now, but this particular detail seems to be lacking. We never seem to get any real detail as to how are we going to grow this economy so that we can actually make inroads into the unemployment rate.
Well, for example, Cyril Ramaphosa might argue that he did engage in some a fiscal investment last year. He announced it. But, for example, an economist like Dumakubula noted that this was actually not even a fiscal increase or increase in spending, but really was a shifting of spend. So I do think that our government really does need to look at using government spending as a stimulus for our economy. We are sticking quite close to austerity type of budget allocations, and I do wonder whether that is still appropriate for an economy like ours that is really in the doldrums.
Kenosi, we've also become accustomed to the same old usual increases in sin taxes, you know, the hikes in the fuel levy, etc., etc. But does this budget not go on then to just put further strain on the average South African, as I was asking Billy?
Could you please repeat that, Sandisa?
I was saying that, you know, we saw the usual tax increases on sin taxes, the fuel levy, etc. But doesn't this just go on to put further strain on the ordinary South African?
The increase in sin taxes, you would have noted that the president had a tough stance on substance abuse, and because of that, to align with his policy to address substance abuse, one would have expected that he would have actually touched on sin taxes and increasing those as a form of increasing revenue to meet the revenue needs of the government. But you would have also noted, though, that the minister did consider areas which were of great concern in the previous year, relating to VAT as well as petrol prices, in that he actually introduced some zero-rated VAT items which would help create some sort of relief for households and consumers. But also with respect to petrol prices, he also didn't increase fuel levies as highly as he did in previous years. So that sort of created some relief for the average South African who doesn't really consume goods which are subject to sin taxes.
Now, talking for a moment about Eskom, for example, and there's talk about, you know, the restructuring of Eskom and other state-owned entities as well. But this essentially is where the problem lies, one would say, because, again, throwing money at the problem, 23 billion rand per year over 3 years comes to 69 billion rand. And the Business Day, their front page, talking about Eskom and the 150 billion rand that we've spent on Eskom over 10 years. So what needs to be done with Eskom, Nwabisa? Because The minister asked a very pertinent question yesterday about how we ought to be thinking about the Eskom question. Do we still need Eskom? And if so, how are we going to take this thing further in a way that makes sense? Or perhaps we don't need it. And if that's the case, how do we then dispose of it? So what's your take on that?
I think it would be difficult to imagine us not needing an Eskom, especially within the public apparatus. I know that many tout privatization or some element of privatization as a way to introduce discipline and efficiency within Eskom. But empirical evidence doesn't show that the private sector will, in fact, or that the efficiency gains that we can see when the private sector becomes involved in an Eskom will really be worthwhile for our country. And so I think that when looking at the problem of Eskom, we shouldn't really pigeonhole it and say, okay, we have to restructure, we have to introduce the private sector, we have to do all of these things. I think that we have to really think about strengthening the bureaucracy behind Eskom, giving people who have the right skills the position to run and to manage it, getting control of graft and the perverse incentives within Eskom that allow it to be such a vehicle for corruption and mismanagement. Absolutely.
Are you confident, Billy, that can be done now? Because what has changed effectively? Again, we're not saying things that are radically different from what we've said 10 years ago, 5 years ago. We're essentially saying the same things. So what has changed with Eskom? And another question, given the appointment of another bureaucrat in that system, is Eskom not effectively under administration as we speak?
Yeah, I think we're all very aware of Eskom at a very tangible level. When our lights go out, it affects all of us. I think what he said very clearly is it can't carry on like this. And he said, putting money into Eskom in its current form, he used the analogy, it's like putting water through a sieve. So I think the details of what the government's thinking are, certainly what the president's thinking are, was outlined in the SONA. Whether that's how it'll pan out, I'm not sure. But something needs to be done. I think what's been happening is we've been propping up failing state-owned enterprises and spending money on salaries. And that was the other key thing that did come out of the budget speeches, that our finance minister would like to see us spending money on infrastructure, because our infrastructure is crumbling. So I think, the precise way forward is not yet clear, but we have been given some quite strong hints of what they're thinking.
But are we asking the correct questions? Are we actually targeting the correct areas to fix these state-owned entities? And the reason I ask this, Kenosi, is because we're talking about, these state-owned enterprises being a drain on the fiscus, and yes, they are. But why are they a drain on the fiscus? Where does the problem, where is the genesis, at its very rudiments, where do the problems actually emanate from? Is it not because of the way in which these entities are run? Is it not because of political machinations that come into play here? We deploy the wrong people into the wrong positions for the wrong reasons, and then we are surprised when these state-owned entities fail.
You would have heard, the minister was quite focused on making sure that he adds professionalism to the entities. And I think it's important to give some room to see how these plans actually pan out, given the conditionalities that he actually gave on the funding which was going to be extended to Eskom. It is important that we actually get the energy sector right, because without getting it right and pursuing economic growth, we're going to cripple economic growth at some point. So the focus on professionalizing the running of these entities is very important. And it's important as well that the civic society, like professionals within South Africa as well as corporates, participate with the minister's initiatives and contribute in terms of how to actually make sure that these plans actually materialize.
But haven't we had professionals in these positions all along? Are we saying the people who have been running these institutions have not been professionals? Have they not been?
I think they have, but again, it's those adverse incentives, the political influences that state-owned enterprises are often subject to that kind of see things pan out the way that they do. And I think that one of the lessons that we need to take from the whole state capture saga is that we as Africans really have to demand transparency from us, the way that our state-owned enterprises are run, even the decisions behind how things like restructuring happen, things like who gets to be deployed where happen. I think that we have to be, as a public, proactive in that, because we've seen in the past that political actors and politicians, even at the highest levels, aren't above subjecting national assets like Eskom to corrupt activities for their own enrichment.
We're running out of time fast, so 30 seconds each, and I want to pulse you guys on a few quick things, starting with you, Nwabisa. With regard to the developmental imperative that Eskom has, Minister Jeff Radebe was talking about 3 million South African households still without electricity. So how does Eskom move forward in its current form in realizing the imperative that it has to deliver on?
Yep. I think that Eskom has to remember that along with a commercial incentive, it also has a social incentive. And in whatever path that they follow, we have to remember that given the levels of poverty in our nation, the social imperative, the electricity and access to free and affordable affordable electricity to our people is of absolute importance. So I think that should be one of the central key motivations behind any kind of rethinking of how Eskom works.
Billy, from a tax perspective, illicit cash flows from this country, how do we need to move forward from that particular perspective, especially given where SARS finds itself? How do they move forward?
Well, I think one of the 5 steps announced was the special unit to deal with these illicit flows. I think we know that it's quite a big number. It's not a huge number. I actually think the biggest number is to increase our economy. That's where the tax revenue will come from. And I think to do that, we need to inspire confidence. And I think Minister Mboweni does inspire confidence. And that confidence needs to be investors, and that's both South African, because South African companies are underinvested in the economy, foreign investors, and of course the ratings agencies, as you mentioned earlier.
And then, Kenosi, just briefly to you, 1.83 trillion rand for this particular economic growth that needs to happen in this country. How do we do it?
There's a bit of interference. Can you just repeat the question?
In terms of the economic growth that we need to realize for this country to really move forward in any meaningful way, how do we go about achieving that?
For us to actually move forward to achieve the economic growth that we want to achieve as a country, the investment in infrastructure, in employment creation needs to actually manifest. Like, we actually need to see that happening. We need to see South Africa increasing its relative competitiveness and increasing demands from other countries for the goods that are produced in South Africa. So there's work to be done in terms of making sure that the people that we have are well trained, and they also adapt well to the demands of the new economy as well, so that we can participate at a global level in a competitive way.
Well, thank you so much. From our Cape Town studios there, Kenosi Magosha, and with me here in Johannesburg, we have Nwabisa Nontendra and Billy Joubert. Thanks to all of you for participating in that discussion. And that, of course, relates to our question of the day as well. At Morning Live SABC, what's your reaction to Minister Tito Mboweni's maiden budget speech? It's time for news now.